everyone, welcome to tonight's webinar on Game Changers. Today's webinar is brought to you by the South Australian Commissioner for Children and Young People and the Australian Esports League. Before we begin, we'd like to respectfully acknowledge and celebrate the traditional owners of the land throughout South Australia, and we pay our respects to their elders and to past, present, and future generations of their children and young people. My name is Domino and I am your host for this evening. I am joined by a very special guest for tonight. Welcome, Junglist. Hello.
Hey, how are you? Thanks for having me.
Good, thank you. How are you this evening?
I'm doing great. I get the chance to talk about games. I'm always happy to do that.
It's always fun, isn't it? Well, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Now, for those who don't know, Junglist found his way into the games industry through competitive gaming, founding the #1 Counter-Strike team in Australia. He then began the Good Game National Gaming Magazine show on the Australian Broadcasting Corporation in 2006, which has gone on to win several IT industry awards, including regularly winning Best Video. Jeremy, or Junglist, also started a weekly review show for Australia's largest telco, Telstra. Running for 3 years, it focused on in-depth game reviews. It also enjoyed recognition at the local IT Industry Awards, winning Best Video. So as you can see, Junglist has a wealth of knowledge from the years of his involvement in gaming. Now, Junglist is going to talk to us tonight about game changers and specifically that. But at the end of the chat, at the end of the webinar, we're going to have a section for some questions. So if you have any questions you'd like to ask Junglist about any of the topics he talks about this evening or something else maybe that you think's been a huge game changer throughout the gaming industry, drop your question in chat. We're going to collect them throughout the stream and we'll have a section for that at the end. But for now, I'm going to hand over to Junglist. So over to you.
All right. Thanks very much, Domino. I tried to pick a few game changers to talk about today that were a little bit different. Each of these sort of has its own takeaway, but at the end of this, feel free to ask me about anything. I've been a critic in games for 12, 13 years or so. I've dabbled in game development, run game development workshops, so you can feel free to ask me about any of that type of stuff. There's so much to talk about when you talk about game changers, especially in the last few years. You can talk about like League of Legends finally doing free-to-play games, right? You can talk about Minecraft and stuff like that, bringing education to games and doing early access, right? So a lot of different things to choose from. So I tried to pick some things that people weren't necessarily talking about a lot, but have some interesting takeaways. So the first one I want to talk about is Captain Forever, and this is sort of a lesser-known game, and that's kind of the point. I want to talk to you about a guy named Farbs, who's this game developer who lives in Canberra, and he was back in 2009. Farbs was working for a AAA game studio, a major game studio, and he one day decided that he wanted to quit, and he sent an email to everyone in his company saying he wanted to quit, but he didn't do it just in the text of the email. He sent them an actual game. And I think we have a video of that game so we can show that. But it's basically like a little Mario game, and then you go through the level and you jump to the flag, and once you reach there, it just says, "I quit." And it was kind of like a cheeky way of resigning, but it wasn't malicious. He just wanted to have a bit of fun with it. And he had sort of seen the direction that independent game development was heading. And he had seen that games are not only easier to make, but easier to publish, and that was crucial. So this was sort of like the rise of the indie game getting on Xboxes and Steam and stuff like that. And so he started making a game called Captain Forever. And I think we've got a video of that game as well, so we can see it. It's a very basic little two-dimensional space game. You put together different parts to create a spaceship, and then you go and fight other spaceships, and then you use the parts from those spaceships to make an even bigger spaceship, and it goes on and on like that. It was a fun little game. It didn't sell like 1 million copies, but he has basically spent from then until now working on this game, and he's released several versions. He's worked on some other projects as well, but this game has largely been his bread and butter. So that's over 10 years of working on one game, and it really sort of rams home the idea that you don't need to sell 1 million copies. You don't need to make $1 million if you want to live the sort of independent artistic life. He sort of saw an opportunity to do what a lot of independent filmmakers are doing and what a lot of independent musicians are doing. It's not exactly a field that you get into to make a lot of money, but it's part of this idea that all you need to do is find your super fans, your true fans. These are the people who, the game idea that you have in your head, for some people out there, that is going to be their perfect idea of what to play. And these true fans are going to be the people that buy everything that you release. So if you have only 1,000 of them and you're charging, maybe $100 a year, so the idea goes, you're actually making decent money. Plenty more than 1,000 bought Captain Forever, and he was charging a lot less. But the economics still sort of works out. So in terms of artistic life, this is kind of when games sort of rejoined music and films, where it's sort of possible to live this life where you're satisfying the needs of like a relatively small group of people, even though the games industry tends to talk about the big Call of Duties and stuff like that. A lot of modern gaming is actually groups of people that have sort of coalesced around a small game idea like this one. And if you wanted to live that independent game maker lifestyle, then that's something that you could potentially target. They don't all have to be a Minecraft. You can have a Captain Forever and live off of that. The next one I wanted to talk about was World of Warcraft. This one is, I pick on World of Warcraft, and a lot of people do, because it wasn't the first to do what it did, but it was the first to sort of mass produce its techniques and refine them. And everybody sort of knows World of Warcraft, so everyone sort of picks on them. But with World of Warcraft, it was really an evolution of RPG systems, and over the years, we've come to learn a lot about what fun is, the concept of fun. And there are different kinds of fun. There's joyful fun, there's competitive fun, and it all comes down to sort of different compulsions that we human beings have evolved over the course of thousands and thousands of years. Compulsions, to give an example, like, why do we enjoy stories? Why do we enjoy narrative? Well, there's an evolutionary advantage to that. There's a competitive advantage to that, because thousands of years ago, if you were sitting around a campfire listening to the stories of the elders, maybe you heard about a particular poison berry, and maybe you didn't eat that poison berry, and that's a competitive advantage you would have over someone else. Similar to, practicing skills, like if you were using weapons, practicing spears or something like that, maybe you would be a better hunter, maybe you would catch better game, maybe people would perceive you as a better mate. So there are evolutionary advantages that you can tie to different kinds of fun. And really what it all comes down to is learning. But around the time of World of Warcraft and beyond is when we started figuring out that we can satisfy these compulsions, or we can manipulate these compulsions. And there was a famous experiment done by a psychologist named B.F. Skinner, who put a rat in a cage and figured out that, the rat figured out every time you press the lever. I think we have a video of this as well, just to illustrate it. Every time you push the lever, the food comes out. And they figured out that they can space out the amount of effort that the rat puts in to give less and less food, or make him put in more and more effort as time goes on. Maybe it requires 2 presses of the lever. Maybe later on it requires 5 presses or 10 presses of the lever. So sometimes when we're playing RPG games, it's a little bit like this. It's, we are performing repetitive, grindy actions, and it's mostly just to get a little bit of reward. And the reason I mention all of this is because it's important to know what kind of fun that you're engaging with when you play a game like this. Obviously, some games, if you're targeting like a Call of Duty or something like that, is obviously targeting a more competitive kind of skill-based fun. RPGs like World of Warcraft are a little bit more about compulsion manipulation than compulsion satisfaction. They're a little bit less towards joyous fun. Like if we, if you consider like a game like Mario, like a lot of what Nintendo does is targeting joyous fun. Whereas a lot of RPG-like systems, if you're noticing your game has a lot of like leveling up bars, if it has a lot of fanfare popping up on the screen, a lot of telling you you're doing well, a lot of virtual numbers going up, all of this is validation, which is not exactly fun. And it's the reason that you can reach the end of a gaming session. Sometimes you would play a game like World of Warcraft. Again, I pick on them, but there are a lot of games like that. You can reach the end of a 4-hour gaming session sometimes and not feel fulfilled. And that's because the game was focusing on compulsion manipulation as opposed to satisfaction. And so a lot of what you're doing in a game like World of Warcraft is like that. Like if you're mining, every little bit of mining or grinding or something like that, there are random chances involved to keep you guessing. Every swing of the mining axe might get you a gem or something like that. And they've taken it a step further, and they've figured out that there are different kinds of player, and they can manipulate the compulsions of different kinds of player. If we could skip ahead to the Bartle matrix. So these are generally accepted to be, several different versions of this graph have been created. But this is generally accepted to be like what the categories that gamers fall into. Each gamer is generally 2 of these. Just to give you an example, I'm a killer explorer. Killer because I really like competitive games, and explorer because I like exploring game systems. And they've put something in a game as big as World of Warcraft to manipulate the compulsions of each one of these groups, to give them something to make them keep wanting to come back. So that's something that as developers, it equals power. And for future budding game developers, you need to be aware that with that power comes a certain amount of responsibility. And just like any power, just like anything that sort of presses the psychological levers in our brain, you can use that power for good or for bad. And so as a society, we tend to focus a lot on things like violence in games, and that's what our classification system focuses on. But there are those, including myself, who would like to see more focus on this type of thing. Like what value am I getting out of a game? How fulfilling is it going to be? Is it satisfying compulsions, or is it purely manipulating them? Is it pure validation? So that's food for thought. The next one I wanted to talk about is Dark Souls. Oh yeah, I skipped over the loot box thing there because I think I went a bit long on World of Warcraft. But friends of my own will be, if they're watching this, they'll be sort of chuckling to themselves because I'll take any opportunity to talk about Dark Souls possible. There are so many reasons why Dark Souls has influenced modern gaming. Back in the day, there was a game, a Zelda game called Ocarina of Time, and it effectively brought gaming from 2D to 3D. And it was known for being a masterpiece because it got so much of what it did right. It got its targeting systems right, combat, boss fights, level design, puzzle solving. It did so much right on the first try, even though you could imagine moving into 3D would be sort of fraught, and it would take some iteration. And so many 3D games since have copied Ocarina of Time. And I sort of liken Dark Souls to like a modern version of Ocarina of Time in terms of how many developers it's inspired and how many ideas it's given gaming. I'll quickly breeze past things like the combat system and the level design because lots of games have taken ideas from that. There's a whole genre called the Souls-like now, which is copying games like Demon Souls and Dark Souls. And generally, if you hear the term Souls-like, you're talking about a combat system. Because the Dark Souls combat system was very stamina based. Everything that you did was attached to the stamina bar, whether it's attacking or rolling or something, blocking, something like that. Typically in a Souls-like combat system, you'll have an evasion roll that has a certain degree of invincibility attached to it. So that's its kind of whole other thing where lots of games are being released that copy the Souls combat system, and even major franchises like God of War, Assassin's Creed, have taken steps towards the Dark Souls combat system because they've realized it's a better way of doing it. It's a more skill-based way of doing it. But what I really wanted to talk about with Dark Souls is the storytelling, because up until this point, if you wanted a good story, games is not really where you would go. You would, if you want a good traditional linear story, you would read a book, you would watch a movie. And it's sort of very rare to find an example of great traditional storytelling in games. The Witcher 3 is a great example of that, but these examples are rare. So Dark Souls is kind of the example of completely going the other way. It's not trying to do a traditional linear story. It's there's very little in the way of cinematics, very little in the way of dialogue. They're instead trying to tell a story through level design and the things that happen to you and the items that you find in the world. So I think what you're seeing now is a group of statues where it sort of looks like three statues should exist, but there are only two. And these are the type of things that you notice while exploring the world, and you're meant to ask questions about that. Why is that the case? And under the hood, there's a whole story about a royal family that tried to erase one of its firstborn son. And some people went through the whole game and they actually thought it didn't have a story. Even reviewers who would complete the game thought that Dark Souls had no story. Of course, it was there. There was an incredibly deep story. It's just that you had to look for it and you had to consult with other community members to put the pieces together, figure out what was going on. Sometimes the statues would be in chains, like asking questions like why that is. There was an example of like pretty much everything that you're told right at the start of the game is false. It's all lies that you've been told. I think we've got a video of how the moon would disappear sometimes while you're exploring a particular zone in the world. And this is the type of thing that really only some people noticed. A lot of people sort of wouldn't even look up. And the fraction of people who did, like even less of those would notice, oh, hey, the moon's only sometimes there. Some people thought it was a glitch. But it's kind of an example of this really understated storytelling. And when you begin to put all the pieces together, it starts to make sense. It's a type of storytelling where it's like someone wrote a book and then ripped out every third page or something like that, or every two pages for every three. And other games have since tried to do a similar thing, but they've only written the pages that they want you to find, right? So the key is in actually writing the whole book and then ripping out the pages. Just to give a few more examples, I think we've got an image from Bloodborne. So this is actually, Bloodborne is not Dark Souls, but it's from the same studio, a very similar game where you're speaking to, the whole entire city has come down with a disease where people are turning into beasts. And you're speaking to this guy in a window who's afraid to come outside, and you notice him coughing a little bit. And as you come back to him throughout the course of the game, you notice he's getting sicker until finally you come back one time and the light's out, the window's broken, and you don't really know what to make of it. And you find a beast nearby and he attacks you and you have to kill him. So this is, again, an example of extremely understated storytelling. There's no pop-up that comes up on the screen and says, hey, the friend that you were talking to before has been turned into a beast by the disease. Where a lot of games would do that and they'd sort of ram it down your throat. This just leaves it for you to figure out. And also this game is kind of, this series of games is innovative in the way that it would incorporate the gameplay into the storytelling. There was a boss in Dark Souls 2, which I've sort of picked as an example of this, called the Mirror Knight. And this boss would, halfway through the fight, he would sort of plonk that big shield down, and you would see someone from within the mirror sort of trying to burst against it. And eventually they would break the mirror and pop out of the shield, and you would have to fight that person as well as the boss. Some people figured it out and some people didn't, that person that popped out was actually a real person. The Mirror Knight was summoning another player of the game to help him fight. And then later on in the game, you can actually join a group that allows the Mirror Knight to summon you to do that. So different ways of playing with narrative that involve the gameplay, interactive narrative. These are ways that Dark Souls has sort of changed the game in terms of how stories can be told. A developer once told me in an interview that he thinks that Counter-Strike has the best story out of any game, which is, to some people it might sound silly because Counter-Strike doesn't have a story. But his point was that the best story in a game is your story. And, anyone who's played Counter-Strike has that kind of personal story of, I busted in a bomb site that one time and there were 3 people there and the terrorists had planted the bomb and I had to defuse it and save everyone. So it's made more special because that story is personal, and Dark Souls kind of takes that idea and just runs a mile with it. And so the last game that I want to talk about is Dive Kick. This is a bit of a weird one to talk about. Again, a little bit of a lesser known game, unless you're in the fighting game community. But this game was an effort to, you can see the controller there. It only has 2 buttons. This is a fighting game with 2 buttons. And this was an effort to pare back fighting games down to its core essentials and strip away all the unnecessary stuff. And fighting games had a bit of a reputation, still do, for being games that are hard to get into. When you're picking up an Xbox controller for the first time, geez, there's like 12 buttons and there are these complex combos that I need to learn. And, for people like me who have grown up with the Street Fighters and the Mortal Kombats and stuff like that, it's been this gradual process that we've learned along the way. Like we know all the Ryu and Ken's fighting abilities, their combos and their special moves. But to someone approaching it for the first time, it's really intimidating. So Dive Kick was an effort to sort of just get rid of the fluff. And they kept on subtracting and paring back until they reached a game that only had 2 buttons, but it was still a very serious fighting game. It still kept the core of what a fighting game should be about. It captured the high level ideas of like distance management and footsies, strategy, counters, dexterous ability, taking into account multiple variables like different characters, speed, and stuff like that. I think we have a trailer of the game so you can see what I'm talking about. And basically, the 2 buttons are just dive and kick. That's all there is to this game. Dive is you can jump and then you can kick. And the kick takes you forward. If you kick the ground, it will take you backwards a little bit so you can manage your distance. When the 2 players collide, if you are higher than your opponent, then that's the one who wins. And of course, there's, characters have different jump heights and different speeds, and some characters can do different things like they can change direction midair and stuff like that. But this this was taken seriously as a fighting game, and it's a great example of how to pare back an idea for a game and still retain what it should be about. So like there were fighting game players that entered tournaments for this game. They were commentated on, very serious tournament players who got salaries. They were entering tournaments for this game. So, it was made by fighting game experts. And while some people made fun of it when it came out, it's actually a really good experiment in how to pare back a game and give it some approachability, some accessibility. I make the distinction between those 2 terms because, when we're talking about accessibility, we're talking about sometimes, especially with fighting games, people with disability might have a hard time getting into them. People who are colorblind, stuff like that, might have issues getting into them. And then approachability is just like, it's not even a case of non-gamers picking it up. It's even gamers who are experts in other genres. Like you can take a StarCraft expert and give them a fighting game, and it's going to be a really intimidating thing to get into. So adding that approachability while keeping the high-level tactics of the game is a really interesting experiment. I know for a fact it's inspired a lot of other developers. There's another fighting game developer who made a game called Fantasy Strike, which is worth checking out. It did a very similar kind of thing. And it's worth asking the question, what other genres can we do this with? Can we do this for shooting games? Can we do this for strategy games? StarCraft kind of already did this in a way. StarCraft, the latest expansion for StarCraft, the Protoss expansion, they kind of admitted like, hey, our early game is really slow and there aren't a lot of strategic decisions that are being made in the early game. So why don't we just pare that back? Why are we doing this? Why not just get rid of it? All of a sudden it's more strategic and it's quicker, which is great. And it's more accessible and approachable. So that's a sort of idea for budding game designers to take forward. I think we're going to see more of that in the future. And I really like the way that Divekick got different developers' brains working on like how can we challenge the assumptions and the assumed knowledge in any particular genre. So that's my game changers. Those are my 4 things. I hope you enjoy them. Please ask questions if you have any, and I'll be sticking around to answer any.
Yes, we do have a couple of questions, but yes, if you have any more questions, do drop them into the chat and we'll add them to our list. Before we do get onto the questions, I just want to sort of quickly talk about that Dark Souls 2, the Mirror Knight. I didn't actually know that about the Mirror Knight, so that's quite incredible. All good there with your mic, Junglist?
Ooh, I can't hear you, Domino, if you're talking.
Oh,
I'm sorry.
My apologies. Yes, there we go. I've unmuted for you. Sorry about that. Yes, I was just saying to the stream that, yeah, we're going to move into questions in a second, but that explains your very confused look, because I was like, he looks a little confused there for a second.
That's me looking. That was me typing to you. I can't hear you.
But yeah, something I wanted to quickly just talk about before we jump into the questions was Dark Souls 2, the Mirror Knight. I didn't know that that was the case, that it was an actual player, from the game, someone else in the real world who came through the mirror. I think that's actually really clever. I think that's fantastic. What I'd like to know is the first couple of people, though, that came to the Mirror Knight, was there anyone in the mirror? Or was it,
No,
was it an
they were
NPC?
bots.
It was
Yeah,
bots then.
those are NPCs, and if you
Right.
play offline as well, they're
They're bots.
NPCs as well. So, but
Okay,
there's so many
okay.
things like that. Like, and even myself as well. Like, I'm a huge Dark Souls fan, but there are so many things. Like, it's actually impossible to know everything. So everyone would have played through that game not knowing everything, and it's almost designed to be for communities to come together and figure out together,
Yeah.
and sort of post like, oh, I figured out this thing and you figured out that thing, and you have to piece it together as a group of thousands of people.
Yeah, no, that's kind of like my mind was blown when you said it. I was like, oh wow, okay, that's actually really, really clever of them.
Awesome,
So
right?
yeah, well done to but From Software do a lot of amazing things, but well done to them on that one. So we will, yeah, jump into the questions now. So our first question, what are your thoughts regarding Warcraft 3 custom mod games spawning new genres like tower defense, MOBAs, and creating party games like Wolves and Sheep?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It was actually one of the things that I was originally thinking about talking about for this as well, because it's super interesting how a game like Warcraft 3, like one of the best things you can do for your game is open it up to modability. That's why I'm a big fan of what XCOM 2 recently did. They just made it so
Okay.
modifiable. It increases the longevity of your game by so much if you let people play with it.
Mhm.
But inherent to that is giving up a level of control, right? And that's something that modern game developers, especially the big companies, don't really want to do, and that's kind of a shame. So Warcraft 3, like it spawns some really awesome whole genres, really like yeah, tower defense, MOBA, like all League of Legends and Dota. We have Warcraft 3 to thank for that. And I think the StarCraft had a really original version of the MOBA games as well. But then they had this whole lawsuit with Valve, because then it's like, who owns the IP? Like one of the original creators of the mod in Warcraft 3 went to work for Valve and create Dota 2 there. So then you've got two competing companies having a legal fight over like who actually owns this game.
Mm.
So obviously Blizzard didn't want that fight again, and they made it so that you can't do that in the remastered version of Warcraft 3. And they, now when a game comes out, you have to be on the lookout for like, okay, if I mod this game, who owns the rights to it? So it's kind of a shame that the new remastered Warcraft 3, it's like if you make something, you don't own it. And they've made that very clear in the terms and conditions. And when you look at that as a creator, you kind of think, well, oh, geez, I kind of don't want to bother. And then us as gamers, we're deprived of all these cool new ideas.
Mm.
So it's a real shame. I don't think anyone really wins with that. Like, yes, you avoid a legal fight, but I don't know. There's probably a middle ground there that could have been reached.
Yeah, potentially. All right, on to our next question. With every publisher launching a battle royale, what are your thoughts on the rise of games like Fortnite?
Look, I'll be honest with you. I don't join in the battle royale craze very much. It's a very interesting gameplay idea. I don't think it's an esport, but I think it's a very interesting gameplay idea of like throwing 100 people into a mix and seeing who comes out on top. I've only really lightly dabbled in the PUBGs and the Fortnites. I played Fortnite for the first time a couple days ago.
Okay.
One of my first three matches, yay! But I think it was matching me up with first time FPS gamers. So yeah, I think it raises a really, for me as someone who's like sort of watching from the outside, like I've been in esports a long time, and I watched the rise of the battle royale, and it's clearly very, very popular, but it's also a struggle to create a fair environment, like a real competitive environment. And maybe someone who's like an expert in battle royales can try and correct me on this, but like for me, it seems like if you are never truly in control of your destiny in a battle royale, like if you have 100 people who are of supposedly an equal skill, and I'm mainly thinking about the Fortnite championships that happened over in New York, where the young guy won like $3 million or something like that, huge prize pool. But is this really a fair esport? Like if when you have no control over, like if people all around you, if three people around you decide to attack you at the same time, you might not have any control over that. At some point, uh, a degree of complexity becomes like randomness. Even though it's not true randomness, when you reach a certain degree of complexity, it becomes akin to randomness. And that's my problem with Battle Royale sort of as an esport, is like randomness in esports has to be very controlled. It has to be very small. You have to be able to respond to the randomness. And when you are in a Battle Royale setting like that, even if you're the best player, you might not always win. And so that's sort of the problem that I have. But, good for a bit of fun. Don't let me stop you having fun with a Battle Royale.
Yeah, I guess there's always that difficulty as well at the beginning is you might land in an unfortunate spot next to someone who happens to get a gun before you. So I'm guessing things like that sort of random nature of where items might spawn on the map as well. It's a bit
Yeah, and
challenging.
certainly you can account for some of that randomness. But, I've seen situations, and in PUBG as well, like I've seen when, if three good players decide to just come at you from all different angles at once, like you can be the best player in the world and you're not winning that game.
Yep. Okay, on to our next question. Do you think party games like Just Dance and Guitar Hero helped gaming become more mainstream?
Yeah, absolutely. I think those are, and I love those games personally. I think they bring gaming to the living room. They offer party experiences. I personally know people who love to sing, and they would play SingStar and not much else. But once the sort of Xbox is in their room, they might give something else a go. Maybe it's just like Peggle or something like that, and then they. Maybe SingStar could be thought of as a gateway, as a gateway game.
To get
But
you
yeah,
into
no,
other games, yeah.
yeah, like I love them. I love the Guitar Heroes. I played those so much. Yeah, great living room games, great for shows as well, like PAX and bringing people together. I think any game that can do that, and other people can kind of understand it as well, especially the different versions of like I forget whether it was Guitar Hero or Rock Band. That brought out the Beatles version, because I know the Beatles version and how it was written about in the New York Times. And like, there were so many people who were Beatles fans. They got gaming for the first time when that Beatles version was released, and they got that it sort of touched them in that way, and it brought people together for the first time. So yeah, those are great. It's kind of a shame that they've fallen off a little bit. Also a big fan of Rocksmith, because there were guitar players who were kind of ripping Guitar Hero because it wasn't, it's not real guitar, man. But, Rocksmith sort of was like, hey, you can actually you play a Guitar Hero style game while learning guitar. Great idea. Yeah, I love those.
Oh, very cool. Okay, next question. Do you think games like Minecraft have changed the way we can play together and form communities?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of like, I haven't played much of it myself, but I'm a big fan of the style of game Minecraft is, but also how it came about. Because again, that was one of the things that I could have talked about in this talk. Was Minecraft is one of the ones that did early access really well. It sort of invited the community in very early. It was an unfinished game. It charged less for it, and it said, okay, if you help me test my game, I'm going to increase the price as time goes on until I eventually get to the real price. But if you get in now and you help me test the game, you can sort of pay a smaller fee. And they built and built and built on top of that. And, people, I think this is one of those games where they sort of misconstrue things like game addiction, because I've got a lot of parents, coming to me and saying, my kid's addicted to Minecraft. And this is something that you deal with when you're known as the quote unquote gaming guy. But people will, they'll depending on the game that they come to me with, like if they say my kid's addicted to Minecraft, I say great, like that's awesome, because Minecraft is like, it's not one of these games that we were talking about before that manipulates compulsions. It's not a game that's about tricking you into thinking you're having fun. It's actual constructive fun. And there are so many other valuable things about it. Like you're communicating with friends, you're planning things, you're learning chemistry. So I'd tell these parents like, hey, did you know that in Minecraft, like when you combine sand and fire, like that's how you make glass?
I was going to say, there is also an education version now of Minecraft, isn't there?
Yeah, so I
Yeah.
haven't actually dabbled too much in the actual education version, but I
No,
think
me
there's
neither.
enormous educational value just even in the normal version of Minecraft, because that planning that you do and the knowledge of the game that you need to build something amazing naturally translates into real life. Like
Mm.
you're naturally learning how different things combine to make other things, and you're communicating with friends to plan projects, and you're learning about people management. And this is something that takes me back to sort of my Counter-Strike days because I put my Counter-Strike managing of a team on my resume. Like if I'm going to apply for a job, that's something that I have on my resume because I learn, and sometimes the the person might ask me about that, and they might be a little bit confused about it. But I learned so much about people management and communication and teamwork and strategy from those days when I was managing a team. And Minecraft's really no different from that. It's pure constructive fun that requires planning and teamwork. So there are games out there to watch out for. Like if a parent comes to me and says, my kid's really addicted to XYZ, and I might be like, oh yeah, that's maybe that you should step in.
Take a
Like
break
maybe
or something.
maybe
Yeah.
less of that would be good because with some games you're not actually getting a lot of value out of it.
Mm.
But Minecraft is one of the ones where there's enormous value to it. So yeah, I'm a big fan of that game. Also, a really great example of how, as a independent game maker, you can make something that visually there's not much graphically involving with the game, but that sold to Microsoft for many dollars, many
Yes.
many dollars.
um, One of the questions we've got in actually kind of continues on with this question. You may have also actually already answered it, but would you like to add anything else? The question's been asked: do you think games can educate or support education? And you've kind of touched on that with Minecraft. Did you want to add anything else in relation to that?
Sure, yeah. I mean, games like in a sort of more like theoretic sense, like with what we were talking about earlier, like fun is inherently linked to learning.
Mm.
Like with the sort of evolutionary stuff that we were talking about, basically everything that is fun to us is linked to some kind of learning. Even though we tend to think about educational games as not fun, but yeah, I mean, when you unlock these sort of psychological tricks, and when you unlock how to make a game sort of inherently fun, as well as the more extrinsic rewards like the validation, compulsion manipulation, and stuff like that, when you know how to do that kind of thing as a developer, some developers are using that for really good purposes, like to teach people either sometimes they're training people on the job, like there are developers who are making games for companies to train them on the job, like whether it's complex mining equipment or whether it's surgeons or stuff like that. Or they you can just use games to teach normal stuff like maths, or they can be used to teach complex political ideas. I've seen independent games that come out that do that, or they can be used for other purposes as well. Like games can be used uh, to heal as well. Which a lot of people are unaware of. They've actually, I believe, in the U.S., the CDC just approved of one game as a sort of medicine, and it's not the
Okay,
first time we've seen
interesting.
that. We've seen in certain hospitals, games are used to because they're so immersive, they can be used to get burn victims to play the game to reduce their pain medication by up to 50%, which is really important because, if anyone who has that experience with a burn wound, the burn kind of pain just really doesn't go away, and they have to cycle the pain medications that people are on, which is a problem because some of those pain medications are very addictive, so they have to cycle them. So if you can reduce the amount of pain medication required by 50%, purely because the game is so immersive, that's a really valuable thing. So yeah, games they can be used to sort of persuade, to teach, to heal, to do all sorts of things that we didn't expect. And really, all that those techniques that we were talking about before, compulsion manipulation, compulsion satisfaction. If you master those as a developer, they really are a power. They're a power that you can use for good.
Mm.
So yeah, absolutely.
That's kind of amazing about the burn victims. I didn't know that. That's incredible. That's something that they've sort of worked on and actually works. That's amazing.
Absolutely.
Okay, this happens to actually be our last question of the evening. If I wanted to become a games reviewer, where should I start?
A game reviewer? That is a good question. I tend to be brutally honest with these types of questions. It's 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 a tough industry to break into. I don't know anyone who regrets getting into it. The traditional path is getting in touch with magazine editors and website editors and telling them you're interested. It is actually a very welcoming industry. Like, a lot of the people are great. They are happy to give you a chance. Like, if you reach out and you say, this is what I want to do. If you don't have much writing experience, just write. That's really the key. Your portfolio is more important than your qualifications. People will be looking at what you've written before more than they'll be looking at whether you've done like a journalism degree or anything like that. I don't have a journalism degree. That type of thing. Like, I don't want to dissuade you from getting a degree, but your portfolio is more important. So writing a lot, honing that craft, very important. Also, having a back and forth with your editor is very important. Make sure, like, if they don't initiate the back and forth, make sure you initiate it and ask them, what can I be doing better? How could I have said this more succinctly? How can I get my point across better so it's more inarguable? All of those things are important. The brutally honest part is that there's just not a lot going at the moment. Media in general has taken a bit of a hit in recent years, and there's not a lot going in terms of solid jobs, and there's not a lot going in terms of freelance work. The sort of gory truth is that in terms of gaming freelancers, you could count within Australia on two hands the amount of freelancers getting regular work. So, that's just me being brutally honest with you. I think, everyone who does it, they love it. I love it. Definitely do it if you think it's your calling. Also, a good idea to make sure that you can transition and you can move sideways into a different industry if you'd like. It's important to be able to do, when times like the gaming industry has ebbs and flows, it goes up, it goes down. During the down periods, important to be able to write about other things. Like, maybe you can dabble in tech journalism. Maybe you can dabble in something else. Maybe you have another skill. It's important to have that other stuff to fall back on. But yeah, I think it's the same with whether you want to start a YouTube channel or become a streamer. Domino can probably offer more insights on, on that type of stuff.
We did actually have a session on streaming previously. So yeah. All right. Well, awesome. Well, thank you so much, Junglist, for your insights this evening. That was, as I said, I learned something, which was fantastic. I'm hoping everyone else learned something this evening as well. So, Junglist, thank you so much for your time and for chatting to us about some game changers today.
No worries. Thank you for having me.
And everyone, just before I do let Junglist go, just make sure you do take a look at his Twitter link there. It's at the Junglist. So, if you would like to keep up to date with his gaming journey and some things he's working on, go and drop him a follow to keep up to date. But yeah, thank you so much, Junglist, for your time.
Thank you.
And everybody, thank you so much for coming this evening to learn about some game changers. Thank you to the South Australian Commissioner for Children and Young People and the Australian Esports League, for without either of them, tonight would not have happened. Now, we do have a feedback form, I believe, for this evening. So we will drop that in the chat in a second. So if you do have some time, we'd love to get your feedback this evening. So just click on that link and just let us know your thoughts about tonight. But otherwise, I hope you've all found tonight beneficial and perhaps learned something new in the world of gaming. Thank you and good night, everyone.